The war wasn't over in a day, but everyone knew the turning point had been reached. The Devourers retreated to the dark spaces between galaxies, their invasion broken by a species they had probably never even noticed before the attack began. Months later, Ambassador Hayrin stood in front of a simple stone monument at the rebuilt Kepler station. The station was bigger now, turned into a major military base and a symbol of the new alliance between humans and the other galactic species. But the monument itself was small and humble, just a black stone with simple words carved into it. Here, when all hope was lost, humans held the line, she read aloud to the gathered crowd of humans and aliens who had come to pay their respects. The ceremony was attended by representatives from every species in the coalition. Altarian generals stood next to human farmers. Nexari warriors shared stories with human engineers. Kethmori scientists discussed research projects with human doctors. The galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. The galaxy had learned something important that day, something that would be remembered for thousands of years to come. Sometimes the greatest strength isn't found in having the biggest ships or the most advanced weapons. Sometimes it isn't about having superior technology or overwhelming numbers. Sometimes the most powerful force in the universe is simply the refusal to give up when everyone else has already surrendered. Captain Mi Young, who had been promoted to admiral after the battle, stood at the viewing deck of the new Kepler station with other survivors like Ji-hoon and Sun Hee. They looked out at the stars together, watching as human and alien ships worked side by side to patrol their shared galaxy. They had held the line when it mattered most, and in doing so, they had saved not just humanity, but everyone. "All vessels, this is Admiral Hyunwoo," he said, his voice steady and calm despite the impossible situation. "Today we write our names in the stars. Today we show the galaxy what it means to be human. On ships throughout the system, human crews listened to their admiral's words. Some were veterans who had fought in dozens of battles. Others were civilians who had volunteered when the professionals were all killed. All of them knew they were about to face something that should have been impossible to defeat." Lieutenant Commander Hee-jin was studying her tactical display, a three-dimensional map that showed the positions of every ship in the battle. The red dots representing Devourer vessels completely surrounded the much smaller cluster of blue dots that marked human positions. She had been trained to calculate odds and analyze battle scenarios, but the numbers she was seeing didn't make sense. "Sir, we're outnumbered 50-1, she reported, her voice betraying just a hint of the fear she was trying to hide. "The enemy has more mass, more firepower, and more ships than we do. By every military calculation, we should surrender now to avoid unnecessary casualties." Admiral Hyunwoo looked at the same display and saw the same impossible odds. Any reasonable commander would have ordered a retreat. Any sane person would have tried to negotiate. But Hyunwoo had spent his entire life studying human history, and he knew that humans had never been reasonable or sane when their backs were against the wall. "Then it's a fair fight," he replied with a slight smile that made several officers chuckle despite their fear. The battle that followed was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. It was brutal and beautiful at the same time, like watching a thunderstorm or a volcano eruption. Human ships swarmed around the massive harvester, like angry sparks flying around a bonfire, their small size allowing them to dart between the giant's defenses. The resonance weapons that Dr. Jae-sung had developed were working better than anyone had hoped. Each time a human ship fired its improvised sonic charges, cracks appeared in the harvester's crystal surface. The wounds weren't big, but they were adding up. The giant alien ship was starting to look like a piece of glass that had been hit with too many hammers, but the cost was terrible. For every crack they put in the harvester's hull, the humans lost ships they couldn't replace. The Hue rising star was vaporized by an energy beam while making an attack run. The converted cargo ship, New Dawn, exploded when its improvised weapons overloaded. One by one, the blue dots on Hyejin's tactical display were disappearing. Captain Young-soo was commanding a squadron of mining ships when his vessel, the Iron Mountain, took a direct hit that destroyed half his engines. Captain Nari's passenger, transport Peaceful Journey, was listing badly, its hull breached in 3 places. Captain Kyung-ho's garbage collector, second chance was held together by emergency welds and desperate prayers. Admiral Hyunwoo watched his fleet being destroyed piece by piece, and he knew they were running out of time. The Harvester was damaged, but not defeated, and soon there wouldn't be enough human ships left to continue the attack. He had one last card to play, but it would cost everything. "All ships, final gambit," he transmitted across the fleet communication system. "Set collision course with the Harvester. Prepare for core overload on my mark." Across the human fleet, captains and crews understood what their admiral was asking. They were going to ram their ships into the Harvester and detonate their power, cores at the same time. It was a suicide mission that might not even work, but it was the only chance they had left. Captain Young-soo acknowledged the order from his damaged bridge. Captain Nari did the same from her listing transport. Captain Kyung-ho confirmed from his battered garbage ship. One by one, every remaining human vessel signaled their readiness to make the ultimate sacrifice. "For humanity," Admiral Hyun-woo whispered, as he ordered the Taeguk to accelerate toward the heart of the Crystal Mountain. Around him, his crew worked at their stations with quiet dignity, preparing to die so that others might live. The human ships converged on the Harvester like meteors falling toward a planet. Their engines pushed far beyond safe limits as they built up the speed they would need to pierce the alien giant's defenses. The explosion was like a new sun being born in the darkness of space. When dozens of human ships slammed into the Harvester at the same time and detonated their power cores, the blast was so bright that it could be seen from star systems hundreds of light-years away. The flash lasted for only a few seconds, but those few seconds changed the fate of the entire galaxy. When the blinding light finally faded, something incredible had happened. The massive Harvester, the crystal mountain that had seemed impossible to destroy, was breaking apart like a piece of ice thrown into a fire. Huge chunks of its crystalline body were spinning away into space, each piece the size of a small moon. The geometric patterns on its surface that had once pulsed with alien intelligence were now dark and lifeless. But the most important thing wasn't the destruction of the Harvester itself. It was what happened to all the other Devourer ships in the system. Without the Harvester's command signals, they began to drift aimlessly through space like lost children. The perfect coordination that had made them so terrifying was gone. They bumped into each other, fired their weapons at random, and moved in confused circles. Commander Seo-jun watched all of this from the bridge of his badly damaged frigate, the Resilient Hope. His ship had been caught in the edge of the explosion and was barely holding together. Half his crew was dead, his engines were failing, and his life support systems were running on emergency power. But he was alive, and he was witnessing something that no one had thought possible. Through his cracked view screen, he could see something that made his heart race with excitement. Ships were approaching from the outer edges of the system, but these weren't Devourer vessels. These were coalition fleets, the same alien ships that had fled in panic just days ago. But now they were coming back and they were ready to fight. The lead ship in the returning fleet was an Altarian dreadnought, its hull painted with symbols that Seo-jun recognized as human writing. As it got closer, he could see that the massive alien vessel had been fitted with crude-looking weapons that were clearly based on human designs. The elegant curves of Altarian technology had been replaced with blocky, practical devices that looked like they had been built in a hurry. "Sir, we're receiving a transmission from the Coalition fleet," reported Ensign Bora from her damaged communication station. Her voice was filled with disbelief as she listened to the incoming message. "They're asking for our tactical data on the resonance weapons. They want to know how to build more of them." Seo-jun almost laughed. These were the same aliens who had once considered human technology to be primitive garbage. Now they were begging to learn from the species they had looked down on for so long. "The Devourers are retreating," Bora called out suddenly, staring at her sensor display with wide eyes. "The remaining ships are actually running away." Across the battlefield, the confused Devourer vessels were indeed fleeing. Without their central command, they had lost the confidence that had made them seem invincible. They were still dangerous, but they were no longer the unstoppable force that had terrorized the galaxy. What happened next was like watching a miracle unfold. species after species joined the counterattack against the retreating Devourers. The proud Altarians, who had once claimed that their technology was too advanced to be improved, were now using human-designed resonance weapons mounted on their finest warships. The Nexari warriors, who had abandoned their posts in fear, returned with crude sonic charges strapped to their fighter craft. Even the Kethmori, the most arrogant and technologically advanced race in the galaxy, swallowed their pride and adopted human tactics. Their sleek, beautiful ships now looked like floating junkyards as they bolted human-made weapons onto their hulls. But these ugly, improvised modifications were working where their advanced technology had failed. The battle turned into a rout. The Devourers, who had seemed unstoppable just hours ago, were now being hunted down and destroyed by the very species they had driven to the edge of extinction. The resonance weapons spread from fleet to fleet, and soon every coalition ship in the galaxy was equipped with some version of the crude human technology. Jae Sung's laboratory looked like a tornado had hit it. Tools and equipment were scattered everywhere. Sparks flew from broken wires, and the floor was covered with pieces of crystal that he had been studying for the past 18 hours straight. Every few minutes, the entire space station would shake violently as another explosion went off somewhere nearby, sending his carefully organized samples flying across the room. But Jae Sung didn't care about the mess. He had discovered something incredible, something that could change everything. His eyes were bloodshot from staring at computer screens for so long, and his hands were shaking from too much coffee and too little sleep, but he couldn't stop working. Not when he was so close to figuring out how to hurt these monsters. "The resonance frequencies are the key," he shouted over the blaring alarms that had been going off for hours. His voice was hoarse from yelling, but he needed everyone to hear him over the noise. Their crystal matrix can't handle these specific disruptions. What he had discovered was that the Devourers weren't just made of ordinary crystal. Their bodies were held together by incredibly complex vibrations, like a song that kept all the pieces in perfect harmony. But if you could find the right frequency and play it loud enough, you could make their entire structure fall apart like a house of cards. The problem was that humans didn't have any weapons designed to create these specific sound waves. Their military had been built to fight other humans, not crystal monsters from beyond the stars. But Jae Sung had an idea that was either brilliant or completely insane. Chief Engineer Eunji was crouched on the floor nearby, welding together pieces of equipment that had never been meant to work together. Sweat dripped down her face from the heat of the welding torch, and her thick work gloves were covered in metal shavings. She was trying to turn ordinary mining explosives into something that could hurt the Devourers. "Mining charges weren't designed for this, Doc," she said, pausing to wipe the sweat from her forehead. "These things are meant to break up asteroids, not fight alien monsters. I'm not even sure they won't just blow us up instead. Mining charges were simple explosives that cargo ships used to blast apart space rocks so they could collect valuable metals. They were crude, loud, and dangerous. Most military engineers would laugh at the idea of using them as weapons against an advanced alien enemy." "Nothing we have was designed for this," Jae Sung replied, connecting the last wire to their makeshift device. "But it's working. Look at the test results." He pointed to his computer screen, which showed wave patterns and numbers that proved his theory was correct. The mining charges, when modified with the right equipment, could create exactly the kind of vibrations that would tear apart the Devourer's crystal structure. Outside the research station, Captain Dong-hyun was leading a squadron of ships that looked like they had been put together by someone who didn't really know what they were doing. His flagship was a converted cargo hauler called the Iron Hammer that had been designed to carry grain between farming worlds. Now it was loaded with Jae Sung's experimental weapons instead of food. The other ships in his squadron were just as improvised. There was a mining vessel that still had rock dust on its hull, a passenger transport that had been stripped of its comfortable seats to make room for weapons, and even an old garbage collector that had been fitted with missile launchers. None of them looked like proper warships, and any military academy would have failed the entire squadron for breaking every rule in the book. But when they faced off against a Devourer destroyer, something amazing happened. The Devourer ship was enormous, like a crystal mountain floating through space. Its surface was covered in geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, and it radiated a cold energy that made human sensors go crazy. Next to it, the human ships looked like toys. When Dong-hyun gave the order to fire, his jury-rigged resonance bombs detonated in perfect sequence. The explosions weren't particularly big or impressive, but they created sound waves that traveled through space in exactly the right pattern. Almost immediately, thin lines appeared across the Devourer's hull, spreading like cracks in ice. "Target their joints," Dong-hyun called out over the radio to his other ships. "Hit them where the crystal segments connect." The human ships swarmed around the massive alien vessel, firing their improvised weapons at the places where different sections of crystal met. Each explosion sent more cracked spiderwebbing across the Devourer's surface. The alien ship began to shudder and twist as its own enormous weight started working against it. Within minutes, the destroyer was breaking apart. Huge chunks of crystal were spinning away into space as the resonance waves disrupted the forces that held the ship together. It was like watching a sculpture dissolve in acid, except the acid was made of sound. Communication Officer Ye Jin was monitoring radio transmissions from across the galaxy when she started picking up something unexpected. Alien voices, speaking in languages from dozens of different worlds, were all saying the same thing in different ways. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. "The humans are actually winning," she heard one Altarian commander say to another. "How is this possible?" "Their weapons are primitive," replied a Nexari scientist, "but they're working. The Devourers are retreating from human positions." For the first time in weeks, Ye Jin was hearing something other than panic and despair in the alien communications. There were new words being spoken across the galaxy: amazement, disbelief, and the first hints of hope in days. The darkness of space suddenly filled with light as the main Devourer fleet arrived. It wasn't like watching ships appear. It was like watching death itself take physical form. Hundreds of crystal monsters emerged from the void, each one bigger than anything humans had ever built. They moved together in perfect formation, like pieces of a nightmare that had learned to dance. But even among these giants, one stood out. The Harvester dominated the center of the enemy formation like a crystal mountain floating through space. It was so massive that it had its own gravity, pulling smaller pieces of space debris into orbit around it. The thing was easily 10 times bigger than Earth's largest space stations, and its surface was covered in geometric patterns that seemed to shift and change when you looked at them directly. Admiral Hyunwoo stood on the bridge of the Taeguk, staring at this impossible enemy through the reinforced windows of his command center. His ship, which had seemed so powerful when it was built, now looked like a tiny insect next to the Harvester. Around him, his officers worked at their stations with quiet determination, even though everyone knew they were looking at their own deaths. The communication system crackled to life as Hyunwoo activated the fleet-wide channel. His voice would now be heard on every human ship in the system. Cargo haulers converted to warships, mining vessels loaded with makeshift weapons, passenger transports carrying soldiers instead of civilians, and the few remaining military vessels that had survived the earlier battles. Admiral Hyunwoo gripped the metal railing of his ship's command center as explosions lit up the darkness outside. The bridge of the Taeguk shook violently with each blast. Through the thick glass windows, he could see something that would give anyone nightmares. Giant crystal monsters floated through space like living mountains, each one bigger than entire cities back on Earth. These weren't normal aliens with ships and weapons. These things were something else entirely. The Devourers looked like they were made of pure crystal, but they moved like they were alive. Their bodies sparkled with stolen light from the stars they had already eaten. When they touched a planet, it simply disappeared, turned into energy that made them grow even bigger and stronger. Lieutenant Sora sat at her control panel, her hands shaking as she tried to keep her voice steady. She had been watching the battle reports come in for hours, and each one was worse than the last. "Sir, the Altarian Third Fleet has been completely destroyed," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "That's 5,000 ships, gone in less than 10 minutes. The Altarians were supposed to be the strongest military force in the galaxy. Their ships could destroy entire moons with a single shot." Hyunwoo had seen their flagship once during a peaceful visit to their homeworld. It was so big that it had its own weather systems inside. Now it was nothing but scattered metal floating in space. The Nexari are abandoning the outer rim stations. Too? Sora continued, reading more reports from her screen. They're not even trying to fight anymore. They're just running. The Nexari were known for being incredibly brave. They were a warrior race that had never backed down from any fight in their 1,000-year history. If they were running away, things were really, really bad. All around the human fleet, alien ships that had seemed impossible to defeat just a few days ago were now flying away as fast as their engines could carry them. These were the same aliens who had once looked down on humans as primitive and weak, the same ones who had laughed when Earth first asked to join the Galactic Coalition 50 years ago. The Zephyrians with their energy shields that could stop anything, the Kromek with their planet-killing weapons, the Vorthan Empire with their fleet of 10 million warships. All of them were running away like scared children. Some didn't even bother to send rescue ships for their own people. They just abandoned entire colonies and star bases, leaving millions to die. Captain Minho walked up beside Admiral Hyunwoo, his face grim. Minho was Hyunwoo's oldest friend and had served with him for over 20 years. They had fought pirates, together, explored unknown star systems, and shared countless meals in the ship's cafeteria. Now Minho's expression was the most serious Hyunwoo had ever seen. "Orders from Coalition Command," Minho said, holding up a communication device. "All human vessels are to fall back to the evacuation zones immediately. They want us to join the retreat with everyone else." The evacuation zones were safe areas near the edge of the galaxy, where civilian ships were gathering. The plan was for all military vessels to protect the fleeing civilians while they escaped to other galaxies. It made sense from a survival standpoint, but something about it felt wrong to Hyunwoo. He turned to look at the tactical display, a three-dimensional map that showed the positions of all ships and enemies in the area. The red dots representing Devourer ships moved across the display in neat, organized lines. Most military commanders saw chaos and random destruction, but Hyunwoo had been studying battles his entire life, and he noticed something that all the brilliant alien strategists had somehow missed. The Devourers weren't destroying things randomly at all. They moved in careful patterns, like farmers harvesting crops in organized rows. They would completely consume one star system before moving to the next. They always chose systems with the most energy first, the biggest stars, the most populated, planets, the largest space stations. It was methodical, logical, predictable. Hyunwoo realized that while the alien races were panicking and running in all directions, they were actually making it easier for the Devourers to hunt them down. The monsters were herding them like sheep, driving them towards specific areas where they could consume entire fleets at once. "Belay that order," Hyunwoo said quietly, but his voice carried clearly across the bridge. Every human officer turned to look at him. "Send word to all human ships in the fleet. We're not running away." The bridge fell completely silent except for the humming of the ship's engines. The Kepler defense grid wasn't much to look at. 3 small space stations floating around an ordinary yellow star that nobody really cared about. Most galactic maps didn't even bother marking it with a name. The stations were old, built from cheap metal and spare parts. They had been used mainly as a fuel stop for cargo ships traveling between more important worlds, but now this forgotten corner of space was about to become the most important place in the galaxy. Commander Jin'ei stood in the main control room of the largest station, watching dozens of screens that showed human ships moving into position throughout the star system. She had never commanded anything bigger than a single ship before, but now she was in charge of humanity's entire defense plan. Her hands were steady as she gave orders, but inside her heart was beating so fast she thought everyone could probably hear it. The station around her was buzzing with activity. Engineers ran through the narrow hallways carrying tools and spare parts. Soldiers checked their weapons for the 100th time. Communications officers spoke rapidly into their headsets, coordinating with ships spread across millions of miles. Valve space. Everyone knew they were probably going to die today, but nobody was complaining or asking to leave. Engineer Taimin sat at his workstation, staring at his detection equipment with wide eyes. The screens showed red dots approaching their position. Devourer scout ships sent ahead to study the human defenses. Each dot represented a crystal monster the size of a skyscraper. "Are we really doing this?" he asked, his voice barely above. A whisper. Are we really about to fight those things? Jin'ei looked at him with calm, steady eyes. The aliens gave up too quickly, she said. They're used to overwhelming force deciding battles. When they see something bigger than them, they run. But we're not like that. We're used to fighting things bigger than us and winning anyway. She was thinking about human history, how small groups of human soldiers had defeated much larger armies throughout the centuries, how her own grandfather had told her stories about fighting in wars where the enemy had better weapons, more soldiers, and more money. But humans had won anyway through cleverness and determination. The first Devourer probes entered the system like glittering death. Their crystalline bodies caught the light from Kepler's star and reflected it in rainbow patterns that would have been beautiful if they weren't so terrifying. Each probe was massive, bigger than the largest human warships, and they moved through space with the confidence of predators who had never met anything that could hurt them. But as soon as they crossed into the system's outer edge, something unexpected happened. Dozens of tiny human fighter ships came pouring out from behind asteroids and space debris, like angry wasps defending their nest. The fighters were so small compared to the Devourer probes that they looked like specks of dust. But they moved, with incredible speed and precision. Pilot Su Jin was leading the first attack squadron in her fighter, called the Rising Phoenix. She had painted a small phoenix bird on the nose of her ship, along with the names of her 2 children back on Earth. As she dove toward the nearest Devourer probe, she felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with combat flying. "Listen, up everyone," she said into her radio, speaking to the other pilots following her. "These things aren't invincible. They're just really, really big. Look for the connection points where different crystal sections join together. Those are the weak spots." She pulled her fighter into a spiraling dive that would have made most people sick to their stomachs. The Devourer probe tried to track her with some kind of energy weapon, but she was moving too fast and changing direction too often. Bright beams of deadly light shot past her ship, missing by inches. Other human fighters followed her lead, weaving between the massive crystal formations like they were dancing. Their small size, which had always been seen as a weakness, was now their greatest advantage. The Devourers had evolved to fight large fleets of big ships. They didn't know how to deal with tiny, fast targets that could slip through their defenses. Meanwhile, larger human ships were taking positions throughout the system. Cargo haulers that had been converted into makeshift warships, mining vessels loaded with explosive charges instead of ore, even some passenger ships that had been fitted with whatever weapons the engineers could find. None of them looked impressive, but they were all crewed by humans who had decided they would rather die fighting than live running away. In nearby star systems, alien observers watched through their long-range sensors with complete amazement. Coalition military commanders who had fled the area days ago were now glued to their screens, unable to believe what they were seeing. The humans weren't retreating like every other species had done. They were actually attacking the Devourers head-on and somehow managing to hurt them.